The smoke-filled saloon buzzed with the usual Friday night energy. Cowboys, ranch hands, and local businessmen filled every table, their voices mixing with the clinking of beer bottles and the shuffle of poker cards. Jake Morrison sat at his regular corner table, a stack of cash beside his whiskey glass. At 42, he owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, and everyone in town knew it. Another good week at the auction, his friend Tommy said, dealing the cards. Heard you got top dollar for those bulls. Jake smirked, adjusting his expensive hat. When you know what you're doing, money follows. He'd been saying things like this for years. Success had made him cocky, and he knew it. But why change when everything seemed to go his way? The other men at the table chuckled. They'd known Jake since high school, back when he was just another ranch kid with big dreams. Now he drove a truck that cost more than most people's houses and wore boots that could feed a family for a month. But Jake had earned every dollar through hard work, even if success had gone to his head. Speaking of knowing what you're doing, said Pete, the local hardware store owner. You see that new woman over there? He nodded toward the corner of the restaurant section. Jake followed his gaze. A woman sat alone at a small table reading a book while picking at her dinner. She looked to be in her 30s with dark hair pulled back and simple clothes that somehow looked elegant on her. There was something different about her. She carried herself with quiet dignity, like someone who'd seen both joy and sorrow. That's Elena Vasquez, Tommy whispered. Moved here about 6 months ago. Runs that little antique shop on Main Street. And? Jake asked, though he found himself studying her more carefully. And every single man in town has tried asking her out. Pete grinned. Every single one got turned down flat. Polite about it, but firm as a rock. Jake raised an eyebrow. In his experience, there wasn't a woman alive who couldn't be won over with the right approach. His ranch, his money, his charm, they'd never failed him before. Maybe they just didn't know how to talk to a lady. Oh, really? Tommy laughed. You think you could do better? I know I could do better. Jake's voice carried that familiar confidence that had closed million-dollar cattle deals. The table went quiet for a moment. Then Pete leaned forward with a mischievous grin. Want to put your money where your mouth is? Jake's competitive spirit kicked in immediately. He'd never backed down from a challenge, whether it was breaking a wild horse or outbidding someone at an auction. What did you have in mind? $10,000 says you can't get her to go home with you, Pete said quietly. 1 week. That's it. The other men exchanged glances. 10,000 was serious money, even for Jake. But more than the money, it was about pride. Jake had built his reputation on never failing at anything he set his mind to. You're serious? Jake asked, dead serious. But there are rules. You can't tell her about the bet. You can't use lies about being someone you're not. And if she says no and means it, you back off like a gentleman. Jake looked across the room again. Elena had finished her dinner and was gathering her things. She moved with purpose, like someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life. Most women in town either threw themselves at him or acted impressed by his wealth. This one seemed like she couldn't care less about any of that. She's probably just playing hard to get, Jake said, more to himself than the others. Maybe. Tommy shrugged. Or maybe she's got her reasons for keeping to herself. Word is she's a widow, lost her husband a couple years back. That information made Jake pause. He'd never been married himself, too busy building his empire to settle down. But he'd seen enough grief to recognize it. Maybe that explained the sadness he thought he'd glimpsed in her eyes. So what's it going to be? Pete pressed. You confident enough to put 10 grand on your famous charm? Jake watched Elena walk toward the exit. She moved past their table without even glancing in their direction. No shy looks, no curious stares at the richest man in the room. She seemed completely unaware of the attention she'd been getting from half the men in the place. The challenge stirred something in Jake that had nothing to do with money. Here was something he couldn't simply buy or intimidate his way into. A puzzle that required actual effort to solve. You're on, he said, extending his hand to Pete. 1 week, $10,000. They shook on it while the others whistled and laughed. But as Jake watched Elena disappear into the night, he felt a strange flutter in his stomach. When was the last time he'd actually had to work to get a woman's attention? When was the last time someone had looked right through him like he was invisible? Better get started tomorrow, Tommy advised. Clock's ticking. Jake nodded, but his mind was already racing. How do you approach someone who clearly values privacy? How do you impress someone who doesn't seem impressed by anything? For the first time in years, Jake Morrison faced a challenge that couldn't be solved with money or bluster. As he drove home to his sprawling ranch house, Jake found himself thinking about Elena's quiet dignity. Most people in town either wanted something from him or wanted to prove they were better than him, but she'd looked right through him like he was just another face in the crowd. Maybe that's exactly what made her so interesting. The next morning, Jake would begin what he thought was just another conquest. He had no idea he was about to meet the one person who would change everything he thought he knew about himself. And he certainly had no idea that Elena Vasquez carried a secret that would shake him to his core. But that night, driving home under the star-filled sky, Jake Morrison was just a confident man who'd never lost a bet and didn't plan to start now. Monday morning came with a fresh confidence for Jake. He'd spent Sunday thinking about his approach, planning his strategy like he would for any important business deal. By 10 o'clock, he was walking through the door of yesterday's treasures, Elena's antique shop on Main Street. The store was smaller than he'd expected, filled with carefully arranged furniture, vintage jewelry, and old books. Everything looked clean and thoughtfully displayed. Soft music played in the background, and the whole place had a peaceful feeling that was completely different from the busy energy of his ranch. Elena looked up from behind the counter where she was polishing a silver picture frame. She wore a simple blue dress and had her hair loose around her shoulders. In the morning light streaming through the windows, Jake could see she was even more beautiful than he'd realized. "Good morning," she said with a polite smile. "Can I help you find something?" Jake had planned to start with his usual confident charm, but something about her calm presence made him feel off balance. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." "Elena Vasquez," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. Her grip was firm, but she pulled away quickly. "Are you looking for anything particular today?" "Actually, I was hoping to look around. I've never been in here before." This was true. Jake had driven past the shop dozens of times but never thought to stop. His house was filled with expensive modern furniture, not old antiques. "Of course, please take your time." Jake wandered through the store, picking up items randomly. A carved wooden box caught his attention and he turned it over in his hands. "This is interesting work," he said. Elena stepped closer and he caught a hint of her perfume, something light and floral. "That's from the 1920s, hand-carved by a local craftsman. The family brought it in after their grandfather passed away. You know the history of everything in here? Most of it." Elena's face softened slightly. "People don't just sell things to an antique shop. They bring memories. I try to learn the stories so I can share them with whoever takes the piece home next." Jake found himself genuinely curious. "What's the story with this one?" "The grandfather used it to store love letters from his wife during World War II. She wrote him every day for 3 years while he was overseas. When he came back, they put the letters in this box and kept them there for 60 years of marriage." Something in Elena's voice when she talked about the letters made Jake look at her more carefully. There was a wistfulness there, like she was remembering something precious from her own life. "That's actually pretty amazing," Jake said, and meant it. Elena seemed surprised by his genuine interest. "Most people just want to know if it's valuable." "Is it?" "The wood and craftsmanship make it worth maybe $50. The story makes it priceless." She took the box from his hands and set it gently back on the shelf. "But you can't put a price tag on priceless." Jake spent another 20 minutes in the shop, asking questions about different pieces. Elena warmed up slightly as they talked, sharing stories about a Depression-era quilt and a set of china that had belonged to a local judge's family. But when he asked if she'd like to have lunch, her polite wall went back up immediately. "That's very kind, but I always eat lunch here at the shop," she said. "I like to stay available for customers. Maybe dinner then? I know a great place about 20 minutes outside town." "Thank you, but no." Her tone was gentle but final. "I don't really date much." Jake left the shop with nothing but a small vintage compass that he didn't really need. But he'd learned something important. Elena wasn't impressed by wealth or status. She cared about stories, about history, about the human connections behind objects. Tuesday, he returned with coffee and pastries from the bakery next door. "Thought you might like a break," he said, setting them on her counter. Elena looked surprised but accepted the gesture graciously. "That's thoughtful of you." "Thank you." They talked for a few minutes about the weather and the town's upcoming harvest festival. Jake found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around women. There was no pressure to impress, no games being played. Elena treated him like a normal person, not the richest man in 3 counties. Wednesday brought flowers, not expensive roses, but a simple bouquet of wildflowers from his ranch. Elena smiled when she saw them, the first truly warm expression he'd gotten from her. "These are lovely," she said, arranging them in a small vase. "Did you pick them yourself?" "My foreman thinks I've lost my mind," Jake admitted. "But yeah, I picked them this morning. They're perfect for the shop." "Thank you." By Thursday, Jake realized something strange was happening. He'd started the week thinking about the bet, about winning, about proving he could get any woman he wanted. But sitting in Elena's shop, listening to her explain the history of a vintage music box, he found himself forgetting all about his friends and their $10,000. Elena was unlike anyone he'd ever met. She was educated and well-spoken, but not in a showy way. She asked thoughtful questions about his ranch and seemed genuinely interested in his answers. When he mentioned feeling isolated sometimes despite all his success, she nodded like she understood exactly what he meant. "Sometimes having everything can feel like having nothing," she said quietly. "When you've worked so hard to build something, you can forget why you wanted it in the first place." Jake stared at her. Nobody had ever put his feelings into words so perfectly. Friday came and Jake realized he was running out of time. The bet would be over in 3 days, but more importantly, he was running out of excuses to visit the shop every day. Elena had remained polite but distant despite his daily visits. She seemed to enjoy their conversations, but she kept a careful wall between them. That evening, he tried a different approach. Instead of asking her out, he simply said, "Elena, I'd like to be your friend. No pressure, no expectations, just, I enjoy talking with you. Would you be comfortable with that?" Elena studied his face for a long moment. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because you're the first person in years who talks to me like I'm just a regular person," Jake said honestly, "and because you make me want to be better than I am." Something shifted in Elena's expression. For just a moment, her careful guard dropped and Jake saw something that looked like loneliness. "Friendship," she said slowly. "I think I'd like that." As Jake left the shop that evening, he realized he'd forgotten all about winning the bet. For the first time in his adult life, he'd found something more interesting than getting what he wanted. He'd found someone who made him want to deserve what he was asking for. 2 weeks had passed since Jake's original bet with his friends, and something unexpected had happened. He'd completely forgotten about the $10,000. Every morning, he found himself looking forward to visiting Elena's shop. Not because of any dare, but because those quiet conversations had become the best part of his day. Elena had slowly begun to trust him. Their talks had moved beyond antiques and small-town gossip to deeper subjects. She'd shared her love of old movies and classic literature. Jake had surprised himself by admitting he sometimes felt lonely in his big house, despite all his success. "Success is funny," Elena had said one afternoon while rearranging a display of vintage jewelry. "People think it solves everything, but sometimes it just makes the quiet louder." Jake had never heard anyone describe his feelings so perfectly. On this particular Friday evening, Jake arrived at the shop just as Elena was closing. She looked tired and he noticed she'd been rubbing her temples throughout the week. "Headache again?" he asked with genuine concern. Elena nodded, locking the front door. "They've been getting worse lately. Stress, probably. When's the last time you took a real break? Had a nice dinner somewhere that wasn't takeout eaten behind the counter?" Elena paused with her keys in her hand. "It's been a while." "Let me take you to dinner," Jake said gently. "Not a date. Just 2 friends, and you can tell me all about whatever's been stressing you out." For a moment, Elena looked like she might refuse automatically, but then she looked at Jake's face, seeing only genuine care and concern. No pressure, no agenda. Just someone who'd become a friend offering comfort. "Okay," she said quietly, "but somewhere quiet. I don't really feel like being around a lot of people tonight." Jake knew exactly the place. 20 minutes outside town, there was a small family restaurant that served home-cooked meals and didn't attract the usual crowd from the bars. As they drove through the countryside in his truck, Elena seemed to relax for the first time since he'd known her. "I'd forgotten how peaceful it is out here," she said, watching the sunset paint the fields golden. "I grew up in a small town like this before I moved to the city." "What made you move back to small-town life?" Elena was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, Sometimes you need to go back to simple things. When life gets too complicated, you remember what actually matters. At the restaurant, they sat in a corner booth away from the other diners. Elena ordered soup and bread, eating slowly like someone who'd forgotten to take care of herself. Jake found himself watching her carefully, noting the shadows under her eyes and the way her hands sometimes trembled slightly when she thought he wasn't looking. "Elena," he said gently, "what's really going on? You've seemed, I don't know, worried about something lately." Elena set down her spoon and looked at him. "Can I ask you something first?" "Of course. Why do you keep coming to the shop?" "Really?" Jake felt heat rise in his face. The honest answer was complicated. It had started as a bet, but that felt like a lifetime ago now. "Because you're the most interesting person I've met in years. Because talking to you makes me feel like myself instead of just the rich rancher. Because you see things in ways I never thought of. And because I think you're carrying something heavy, and I wish you'd let someone help you carry it." Elena's eyes filled with tears and she looked away quickly. "You don't know what you're asking." "Then tell me." Elena was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the darkening sky. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband didn't just die, Jake. We had problems. Big problems. The kind that make you question everything you thought you knew about love and trust." She took a shaky breath. "When he passed away, I realized I'd been living with a stranger. Someone who'd been lying to me about important things for years." Jake felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." "It was. And ever since then, I've been terrified of trusting anyone again. Terrified of letting someone close enough to hurt me like that." Elena finally looked at him. "That's why I moved here. That's why I don't date. I'm not sure I remember how to trust my own judgment about people." Jake reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his. "For what it's worth, I think your judgment is just fine. You've been careful with me, but you've also been kind. You've given me a chance to prove I'm worth your friendship." Elena didn't pull her hand away. "You have proven that. You've been nothing but respectful and patient even when I've kept walls up." "The walls are okay," Jake said softly. "I understand them." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, Jake's hand still covering hers. Finally, Elena spoke again. "I've been thinking about something you said last week, about how having everything can feel like having nothing. Yeah, I think I've been so afraid of having nothing again that I've been choosing nothing. Does that make sense?" Jake nodded. "Perfect sense." Elena looked at their joined hands, then back at his face. "I'd like to try something different, just slowly. If you're willing to be patient with someone who's out of practice at trusting people." "I've got all the time in the world," Jake said, and meant it completely. After dinner, Jake drove Elena back to her small house on the quiet street behind Main Street. It was a modest place with a garden in front and warm light glowing in the windows. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Elena asked, and Jake could hear the nervousness in her voice. "Only if you're sure." "I'm sure. I think I'm tired of being afraid all the time." Elena's house was as carefully arranged as her shop, filled with comfortable furniture and personal touches that made it feel like a real home. She made coffee while Jake looked at the books on her shelves and the photographs on her mantel. When she returned with 2 mugs, they sat on her couch and talked until nearly midnight. About their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Elena told him about her love of old movies and how she'd always wanted to travel but never found the right time. Jake shared stories about building his ranch from nothing and how success had sometimes felt hollow without someone to share it with. As the evening wound down, Elena walked Jake to the door. They stood there for a moment, both aware that something important had shifted between them. "Thank you," Elena said softly. "For dinner, for listening, for being patient with me." "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me in," Jake replied. Elena stepped closer and very gently kissed his cheek. "Good night, Jake." As Jake drove home, he realized he felt different than he had in years. Calmer, more hopeful, like he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. The bet with his friends seemed like something from another lifetime, completely irrelevant to what was growing between him and Elena. He had no idea that Elena was standing at her window, watching his taillights disappear, fighting back tears for reasons she couldn't yet bring herself to tell him. 3 weeks after their first dinner together, Jake and Elena had fallen into a comfortable routine. He'd stop by her shop most afternoons, sometimes bringing coffee or lunch to share. They'd take evening walks around town or sit on her front porch talking until the stars came out. Jake had never felt so at peace with another person. Elena seemed to be relaxing too. She smiled more often, laughed at his stories about ranch life, and had even started sharing memories from her childhood. But Jake noticed she still seemed tired often, and sometimes he'd catch her staring off into space with a worried expression she'd quickly hide when she noticed him watching. This particular evening, Elena had cooked dinner for them at her house. It was simple, pasta with homemade sauce and a salad from her garden, but it felt special because she'd taken the time to make it just for him. "This is incredible," Jake said, gesturing with his fork. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Elena smiled, but there was something sad in her eyes. "My grandmother taught me when I was little. She said cooking was how you showed people you cared about them." She sounds like a wise woman. She was. She used to say that food made with love tastes different than food made just to fill your stomach. Elena paused, looking down at her plate. "I hadn't cooked for anyone in a long time before tonight." Jake reached across the small table and took her hand. "I'm honored to be the first." After dinner, they sat on Elena's couch with glasses of wine, talking quietly. The conversation had turned to their hopes for the future, and Jake found himself being more honest than he'd ever been with anyone. "You know what's funny?" he said. "I spent years building that ranch, making all that money, thinking success would make me happy. But the happiest I've been in years is sitting right here with you, talking about nothing important." Elena turned to look at him. "Jake? Yeah? I need to tell you something." Her voice was serious, and Jake felt his stomach tighten with worry. "Okay." Elena seemed to struggle with her words. "I haven't been completely honest with you about my past, about why I really moved here." Jake's heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" Elena looked down at her hands. "It's not that I lied exactly. It's just, there are things I haven't told you. Important things. Elena, whatever it is, we can work through it. You can trust me." She looked up at him then, and Jake saw tears in her eyes. Can I really trust you?" "Yes," Jake said without hesitation. "Whatever you need to tell me, I'm here." Elena studied his face for a long moment. Then very slowly she leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and hesitant at first, but when Jake responded gently, she deepened the kiss. When they broke apart, Elena rested her forehead against his. "I've been so scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of caring about someone again. Of letting someone matter." She looked into his eyes. "But you already matter, Jake. More than I meant to let you." Jake cupped her face gently in his hands. "You matter to me too. More than anything has in a long time." Elena closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. "Will you stay tonight?" "I don't want to be alone." Jake's answer was to kiss her again, pouring all the tenderness and care he felt into that simple gesture. They made love slowly, carefully, like two people who'd been hurt before and were determined not to hurt each other. It was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Not just physical, but emotional in a way that left him feeling completely vulnerable and completely safe at the same time. Afterward, they lay together in Elena's bed, her head on his chest while he stroked her hair. Jake felt a peace he'd never known before, like he'd finally found the missing piece of himself. "Elena, I need you to know something. Whatever happened in your past, whatever you're worried about telling me, it doesn't change how I feel about you." Elena lifted her head to look at him. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do. I know enough. I know you're kind and smart and brave. I know you've been hurt, but you're still willing to take chances on people. I know that what we have is real." Jake brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Whatever else there is, we'll figure it out together." Elena's eyes filled with tears again. "You might not feel that way when you know everything. Try me." Elena was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might have fallen asleep. But then she spoke so quietly he almost missed it. "I'm sick, Jake." Jake's heart stopped. "What do you mean sick?" Elena sat up, pulling the sheet around herself. I have a condition. Something that's going to get worse." Jake sat up too, his mind racing. "What kind of condition? Can it be treated? It's complicated?" Elena's voice was shaking now. "The doctors aren't sure how fast it will progress, but eventually." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Jake saw the fear in her eyes. "Elena, Whatever it is, we'll face it together. You don't have to go through this alone. You don't understand. This isn't something you can fix with money or determination. This is something that's going to change everything about who I am. Jake felt cold suddenly. Tell me. But Elena shook her head. Not tonight, please. Let me have tonight before everything changes. Jake wanted to push, wanted to know what they were dealing with. But the look on Elena's face stopped him. Instead, he pulled her close again. Okay, he said softly. Tonight is ours. They held each other in the darkness, both awake long after they should have been sleeping. Jake's mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. But every time fear started to overwhelm him, he looked at the woman in his arms and knew that whatever was coming, he wasn't going anywhere. Elena lay still, listening to Jake's heartbeat, memorizing the feeling of safety in his arms. She knew she should tell him everything, but she was terrified that once he knew the truth, this perfect feeling would disappear forever. In the morning, Jake woke before Elena and quietly slipped out of bed to make coffee. Elena's kitchen was small and homey, and he enjoyed the simple task of starting their day together. But as he reached for mugs in the cabinet, he noticed something that made him pause. Behind the coffee cups, partially hidden, were several orange prescription bottles. Jake wouldn't normally look at someone's private medications, but one of the labels caught his eye. The medication name was long and complicated, nothing he recognized. But what struck him was the warning label, may cause confusion and memory loss. Jake stood there holding the coffee mug, his mind spinning. Memory loss. Elena's recent tiredness, her occasional distant looks, the way she sometimes seemed to struggle with words or forget what they'd been talking about. When Elena appeared in the doorway wearing his shirt from the night before, Jake quickly closed the cabinet and smiled at her. Good morning. Beautiful. Elena smiled back, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She knew their conversation from last night wasn't over. She knew she was running out of time to tell him the truth. Good morning, she said softly. Sleep well? Better than I have in years, Jake said honestly. And it was true. Despite his growing concerns, lying next to Elena had felt like coming home. As they drank their coffee together in the morning light, both of them knew that everything was about to change. The question was whether their newfound love would be strong enough to survive the truth. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake found himself watching Elena more carefully, not in a suspicious way, but with the attention of someone who truly cared about another person's well-being. And the more he watched, the more concerned he became. Little things at first. Elena would start telling him a story about a customer, then stop mid-sentence and look confused. What was I saying? She'd ask with a forced laugh. I completely lost my train of thought. Or she'd ask him the same question twice in one conversation, not remembering that he'd already answered. When Jake gently reminded her, Elena would get a look of embarrassment mixed with something that might have been fear. One afternoon, Jake arrived at the shop to find Elena standing in the middle of the store, staring at a display case with a puzzled expression. Everything okay? He asked. Elena startled, like she hadn't heard him come in. Oh, Jake, yes, I'm fine. I was trying to remember when I put that jewelry set there. It seems like it should be somewhere else, but I can't remember moving it. Jake looked at the display. It was the same vintage jewelry collection that had been in that exact spot since his first visit to the store weeks ago. It looks good there, he said carefully. Very eye-catching. Elena nodded, but she still looked uncertain. Yes, you're right. That evening they went to dinner at their usual quiet restaurant outside town. Elena seemed more like herself, laughing at Jake's stories about his ranch foreman's ongoing battle with a particularly stubborn bull. But when their food arrived, she stared at her plate for a moment with confusion. I'm sorry, she said to the waitress. I think there might be a mistake. I ordered the fish, didn't I? The waitress looked puzzled. You ordered the chicken pasta, miss. Same thing you always get when you come in. Elena's face flushed red. Of course. I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that. Jake reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Long day? He asked gently. Something like that. But Jake noticed Elena barely touched her food, and she was unusually quiet during the drive home. The incidents became more frequent. Elena would forget appointments with customers and find frantic notes in her own handwriting, reminding her of things she couldn't remember writing. She started keeping a small notebook with her at all times, constantly checking and rechecking what she'd written there. Jake also noticed Elena taking pills more often. She'd step away to the back room of her shop or excuse herself to the bathroom, and when she returned, she'd seem slightly unsteady for a few minutes. When Jake asked about it, Elena always had a ready explanation. Headache medicine, vitamins, something for her allergies. The explanations were reasonable, but something about the way Elena avoided his eyes when she gave them made Jake's stomach clench with worry. One evening, Jake's friends cornered him at the saloon. He'd been avoiding them for weeks, completely forgetting about their original bet until Tommy brought it up. "So how's that bet going?" Pete asked with a grin. "It's been over a month now." "You win yet?" Jake looked at them with confusion. "What bet?" "The widow," Tommy laughed. "Elena Vasquez. $10,000, remember?" The memory hit Jake like a physical blow. The bet, the dare, the reason he'd approached Elena in the first place. He'd completely forgotten, so caught up in genuinely caring about her that the original motivation had disappeared entirely. "That's off," Jake said quickly. "The bet's off." "What do you mean it's off?" Pete demanded. "You can't just call off a bet because you're losing." "I'm not losing. I'm calling it off because it was stupid." Jake's voice was sharp. "Elena's not some prize to be won. She's—" He stopped, realizing he was about to say she was the woman he loved. When had that happened? When had a dare turned into the most important relationship of his life? "She's what?" Tommy pressed. "She's going through something difficult and she needs support, not games." Jake threw money on the table for his drink. Find something else to bet on. He left the saloon feeling sick about the whole thing. How could he have been so callous? How could he have reduced Elena to a bet even at the beginning? She deserved so much better than that. The guilt ate at him for days. Jake knew he should tell Elena about how their relationship had started. But every time he looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the fear she tried to hide and the way she sometimes seemed lost in her own life, he couldn't bring himself to add more stress to whatever she was dealing with. Instead, he tried to be more supportive. He started spending even more time at the shop, helping with customers and doing small repairs around the building. Elena seemed grateful for the help, but Jake noticed she was becoming more dependent on the notebook she carried everywhere. One afternoon, Jake watched Elena serve a customer, a regular who came in every few weeks looking for vintage books. Elena went through her usual friendly routine, but when the woman asked about a specific author they'd discussed many times before, Elena looked completely blank. "I'm sorry," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly. "Could you remind me which author you're looking for?" The customer looked surprised. "Charles Dickens. We've talked about your first edition collection several times." Elena stared at her for a moment, then quickly excused herself to the back room. Jake found her there a few minutes later, sitting on a box with her head in her hands. "Elena?" She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "I've sold books to Mrs. Peterson for 6 months. I know exactly which Dickens novel she's looking for. I've ordered special books for her." Her voice broke. "And for 5 minutes I couldn't remember any of that." Jake knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Elena, you need to tell me what's going on. Please. Whatever it is, we can handle it together." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "You keep saying that. But Jake, what if it's something we can't handle? What if it's something that changes everything about who I am? Then we'll figure out how to love who you become." The words came out before Jake even realized he was going to say them. Love. He'd said, love. Elena's breath caught. "Jake, I mean it. I love you, Elena. Whatever this is, whatever you're afraid of, it doesn't change that." Elena started crying then, really crying, and Jake pulled her into his arms. "I love you too," she whispered against his chest. "That's what makes this so terrifying. I finally found someone I can't bear to lose, right when I'm about to lose everything else." "You're not going to lose me," Jake said firmly. "Whatever this is, you're not going to lose me." But even as he said it, Jake felt a cold fear in his chest. Elena's words, "lose everything else," suggested something bigger than he'd imagined. Something that might test his promise in ways he couldn't yet understand. That night, Elena finally agreed to tell him everything. As they sat on her couch, she took his hands in hers and looked into his eyes. "Jake, what I'm about to tell you is going to change how you see our future together, maybe how you see me. Elena, nothing could change how I feel about you. Promise me you'll let me tell you everything before you say anything. Promise me you'll really think about what it means before you make any decisions about us. Jake's heart was pounding, but he nodded. I promise, Elena took a deep breath. It started about 3 years ago, right before my husband died. I was having trouble remembering things. Small things at first. Where I put my keys, what I'd eaten for lunch, names of people I'd known for years. Jake felt the bottom drop out of his stomach, but he kept quiet. The doctors ran tests. Lots of tests. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper now. Jake, I have early onset Alzheimer's disease. I'm 34 years old and I'm losing my mind. Jake felt like someone had punched him in the chest. The words hung in the air between them. Alzheimer's disease. Early onset. Elena was only 34. I know what you're thinking, Elena said quickly, misreading his shocked silence. I know how horrible it sounds. The doctors said most people my age don't get this type, but it happens. And when it does, it usually progresses faster than the kind older people get. Jake's mind was reeling. All the little signs suddenly made perfect sense. The confusion, the memory lapses, the medication, the notebooks, the fear in her eyes. Elena had been living with this devastating knowledge for 3 years, facing it mostly alone. Elena, he started, but she held up her hand. Please, let me finish. I need to tell you everything. Jake nodded, though every instinct told him to pull her into his arms and tell her nothing else mattered. When the doctors first diagnosed me, I was married to David. We'd been together for 8 years, married for 5. I thought we were solid, that we could handle anything together. Elena's voice was steady now, like she'd practiced this speech. But when I told him what the doctors had found, everything changed. How? David couldn't handle it. He'd look at me like I was already gone, like I was a ghost of the person he'd married. He started working longer hours, staying away from home. When I'd forget something or get confused, he'd get this look of horror on his face. Elena wiped away a tear. I understand now. It was terrifying for him too. But at the time, it felt like I was losing my husband and my mind at the same time. Jake felt anger rising in his chest. What kind of man abandons his wife when she gets sick? 6 months after my diagnosis, David was killed in a car accident. He was coming home late from work like he did every night by then. The roads were icy. Elena's voice broke slightly. I've always wondered if he was distracted thinking about us, about what our future looked like. Elena, that wasn't your fault. Maybe not. But it felt like it was. After the funeral, I realized I was completely alone with this thing growing in my brain. David's family blamed me somehow, like my illness had caused his death. My own family lived across the country and didn't really understand what I was facing. Jake was starting to understand why Elena had been so careful about letting him get close, so I sold everything and moved here. I figured if I was going to lose my mind, I wanted to do it somewhere peaceful. Somewhere I could have a few good years before. She gestured helplessly. Before what? Before I forget who I am. Before I can't take care of myself. Before I become someone else entirely. Elena looked directly at him. Jake, do you understand what I'm telling you? This isn't something that gets better. It only gets worse. Eventually, I won't remember you. I won't remember this conversation. I won't remember loving you. The room was completely quiet. Jake could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Elena's shaky breathing. He thought about everything they'd shared over the past 2 months. The laughter, the quiet conversations, the way Elena made him feel like the best version of himself. How long? He asked quietly. The doctors don't know for sure. It's different for everyone. Maybe 5 years before I need full-time care. Maybe 10 if I'm lucky. Maybe less. Elena's voice was matter-of-fact now. The medication I take slows it down a little, but it doesn't stop it. Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Elena's small garden. His mind was spinning with information, trying to process what this meant for them, for the future he'd been starting to imagine. There's more, Elena said behind him. Jake turned around. More? I haven't been completely honest about David. Jake felt his stomach drop. What do you mean? Elena stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room. She pulled out a folder and handed it to Jake. David isn't dead, Jake. He's alive in a memory care facility about an hour from here. Jake stared at the folder. I don't understand. When I said he was killed in a car accident, that was easier than explaining the truth. Elena's voice was barely audible. The truth is that David left me. 3 months after my diagnosis. He packed his bags and moved out. He said he couldn't watch me disappear. He said it was too hard. Jake felt like the floor was shifting under his feet. So why did you tell me he was dead? Because saying your husband abandoned you when you got sick sounds pathetic. Saying he died makes me a tragic widow instead of a woman who wasn't worth staying for. The pain in Elena's voice broke Jake's heart. He set the folder aside without opening it and crossed the room to her. "Elena, look at me." She shook her head. "I can't. I know what you're thinking. I know you're trying to figure out how to leave without hurting my feelings." "Is that what you think?" "It's what I know. I've been through this before, remember?" Jake gently took Elena's face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "I'm not David. You don't know what you're signing up for. Jake, you don't know what it's like to watch someone you love forget your name, forget how to feed themselves, forget that they ever loved you back. You're right. I don't know what that's like." Jake's voice was steady. "But I know what it's like to love you. And I know that doesn't just disappear because things get difficult." Elena started crying again. "Jake, please don't make promises you can't keep. Please don't say things you'll regret later when this gets really bad. The only thing I regret is that you've been carrying this alone for so long." Jake pulled Elena into his arms, holding her while she cried. His mind was still reeling with everything she'd told him, but one thing was crystal clear. He wasn't going anywhere. "I need time to process all of this," he said honestly. "But Elena, I need you to understand something. This doesn't change how I feel about you. It changes what we're dealing with, but it doesn't change my feelings." Elena pulled back to look at him. "How can you say that? How can you possibly know that?" "Because I've been falling in love with you while you've been dealing with this. The woman I love is someone who faces impossible circumstances with grace. Someone who builds a beautiful life even when she's scared. Someone who's braver than she knows." Jake wiped tears from her cheeks. "This disease might take your memories, Elena, but it can't take away who you are. And who you are is extraordinary." Elena searched his face. "What if I forget you? Then I'll remind you every day who you are and how much you're loved. What if I can't take care of myself? Then I'll take care of you. What if I become someone you don't recognize?" Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Then I'll love whoever you become because they'll still be you." Elena collapsed against him, sobbing. Jake held her close, feeling the weight of what they were facing settle around them. It was terrifying and heartbreaking and completely overwhelming. But underneath all of that was something unshakable. He loved this woman. And love didn't come with conditions about staying healthy or keeping all your memories. Love meant showing up, especially when things got hard. As Elena cried in his arms, Jake made a decision. Whatever time they had together, whether it was 5 years or 50, he was going to make sure Elena never doubted for a single day that she was loved completely and unconditionally. The disease might take her memories eventually, but Jake was going to fill every day they had left with moments worth remembering, for as long as she could remember them. Jake didn't sleep that night. He held Elena until she fell into an exhausted sleep around 3 in the morning, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. Everything she'd told him replayed over and over. The diagnosis, David's abandonment, the devastating future they were facing together. By morning, Jake had made peace with Elena's illness. The woman he loved was sick and they would face it together. But there was something else weighing on his mind, something that felt like a stone in his chest every time he looked at Elena's trusting face. The bet, the original dare that had brought him to her shop. Elena had been completely honest with him about her past, her fears, her illness. She'd trusted him with the most vulnerable parts of herself, and he was keeping a secret that would destroy that trust if she ever found out. Jake knew he had to tell her. The longer he waited, the worse it would be. But how do you tell someone you love that your relationship started as a cruel bet? How do you explain that their trust was built on a lie? Over breakfast, Elena seemed lighter than she had in weeks. The relief of finally sharing her secret had lifted a weight from her shoulders. "I keep expecting to feel regret about telling you," she said, sipping her coffee. "But I just feel free. For the first time in 3 years, I don't have to pretend everything's fine." Jake's stomach twisted with guilt. "Elena, there's something I need to tell you too." Elena looked up from her coffee. "Okay." Jake had rehearsed this conversation in his head all night, but now that the moment was here, he couldn't find the words. How do you destroy someone's faith in you when they've just given you their complete trust? "It's about how we met," he started carefully. "At the restaurant that night?" "No, before that." "About why I came to your shop that first day." Elena set down her coffee cup. Something in Jake's tone had caught her attention. "I'm listening." Jake took a deep breath. That night at the restaurant when I first saw you, I was there with some friends. We'd been drinking, playing poker, talking about... He stopped, hating himself for what he was about to say. Talking about what, Jake? About you. About how every man in town had tried to ask you out and gotten turned down. Elena's expression didn't change, but Jake saw something shift in her eyes. A wariness that hadn't been there moments before. And they dared me to try. They bet me $10,000 that I couldn't get you to spend the night with me. The words hung in the air like poison. Elena stared at him without speaking for so long that Jake wondered if she'd heard him. A bet, she finally said, her voice completely flat. Elena, please let me explain. A bet. Elena stood up from the table, her coffee cup clattering against the saucer. You approached me because of a bet. It started that way. But everything we've shared, everything I've told you, everything we've done together, it all started because you wanted to win money by sleeping with me. Jake stood up too, reaching for her, but Elena stepped back. Elena, please. Yes, that's how it started, but that's not what this is now. I forgot about the bet weeks ago. I fell in love with you. When? Elena's voice was sharp now. When exactly did you forget about the bet? Before or after you got me into bed? Jake felt sick. Elena, it's not like that. Answer the question. When did you forget about the bet? Jake closed his eyes. After. But Elena, by the time we made love, my feelings were completely real. The bet meant nothing to me anymore. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. So you did win then? You got what you set out to get. No, I never collected on the bet. I told them it was off. I told them you weren't some prize to be won. But not until after you'd already won it. Jake felt like he was drowning. Every word he said seemed to make things worse. Elena, please. I know how this sounds, but you have to believe me. What we have is real. My feelings for you are real. Are they? Elena's eyes were filling with tears, but her voice was steady. How would I know? How would I know the difference between real feelings and you being really good at winning bets? Because I'm telling you the truth now. I could have never told you about this, but I did because I love you and I don't want any lies between us. You told me because you felt guilty. There's a difference. Elena walked to the window, her back to Jake. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet. Do you know what the worst part of my diagnosis was? It wasn't knowing I was going to lose my mind. It wasn't facing David's rejection. It was realizing that I couldn't trust my own judgment anymore. About anything. About anyone. Jake felt his heart breaking. Elena, I came here to start over. To prove to myself that I could still make good decisions. That I could still tell the difference between people who cared about me and people who were just pretending to care. She turned around to face him. And the first man I let myself trust, the first man I let myself love, was pretending from the very beginning. I wasn't pretending. Not after the first week. Elena, you changed everything for me. How would I know that? How would anyone know that? Elena wiped tears from her cheeks. Jake, I told you yesterday that the worst thing about this disease is that eventually, I won't be able to tell the difference between what's real and what's not. But it turns out I already can't tell the difference. Jake moved toward her, but Elena held up her hand. Don't. Please don't touch me right now. Elena, we can work through this. People make mistakes. Relationships survive bigger problems than this, do they? Do they survive this kind of betrayal? Jake was desperate now. It wasn't a betrayal. I was an idiot who made a stupid bet, but then I fell in love with you. Really, genuinely in love. Everything since that first week has been real. But I'll never know that for sure, will I? I'll never know when you stopped pretending and started meaning it. I'll never know if you're still here because you love me or because you feel sorry for the sick woman you tricked into bed. That's not why I'm here, isn't it? Elena's voice broke. Yesterday I told you I have Alzheimer's disease. I told you I'm going to lose my mind and become someone you won't recognize. And you immediately started making promises about staying with me forever. Don't you think that's convenient timing? Jake felt like she'd slapped him. You think I'm staying out of pity? I think you're a good man who feels guilty about lying to a sick woman. I think you're the kind of person who would sacrifice his own happiness to take care of someone he hurt. Elena, that's not... I can't do this, Jake. Elena's voice was firm now. I can't be with someone when I'll never know if what we have is real or if it's just guilt and pity dressed up as love. It's not guilt and pity. It's love. Real love. Maybe it is. But I'll never believe that now. Every time you tell me you love me, I'll wonder if you're just trying to make up for that bet. Every time you take care of me, I'll wonder if it's because you want to or because you feel obligated. Elena looked directly at him. I have enough doubt and confusion coming my way, Jake. I can't add this to it. Jake felt panic rising in his chest. So what are you saying? I'm saying I need you to leave. I need you to leave and not come back. Elena, please, don't let one stupid mistake destroy what we have. What we have is built on a lie. It doesn't matter how real it became later. The foundation is rotten and I can't build a life on that. Jake stood there looking at the woman he loved, seeing the pain and betrayal in her eyes, knowing he had caused it. Everything Elena had said was wrong. His love for her was absolutely real. His desire to stay with her had nothing to do with guilt. But he also understood why she couldn't believe him. After everything she'd been through, after David's abandonment and her illness and the fear of losing herself, she'd finally trusted someone completely, and that someone had lied to her from the very beginning. If I leave now, Jake said quietly, will you ever give me another chance? Ever? Elena looked at him for a long moment. I don't know. Maybe someday when I can think clearly about this, but not now. Right now I need you to go. Jake wanted to argue more, wanted to fight for them, but he could see that pushing would only hurt Elena more. She'd been through enough. I love you, he said as he walked toward the door. Whatever you believe about how this started, please believe that. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone. Elena didn't answer. She stood at the window with tears streaming down her face, watching the man she loved walk out of her life for the second time in 3 years, this time because of choices he'd made. As Jake drove away, he realized that losing Elena felt worse than anything he'd ever experienced, worse than business failures, worse than physical pain, worse than any loss he'd faced before. He'd finally found the one person who made him want to be better than he was, and he'd lost her because of who he'd been before he met her. 3 weeks passed without Jake seeing Elena. 3 weeks of driving past her shop without stopping, of picking up his phone to call her and setting it back down, of lying awake at night thinking about everything he'd lost. His ranch felt empty and meaningless. Success felt hollow when there was no one to share it with. Jake's friends tried to cheer him up, but they didn't understand what had happened. They thought he was upset about losing a bet, not about losing the love of his life. When Tommy suggested they find him someone new to chase, Jake walked away without a word. During those long, empty weeks, Jake did a lot of thinking. He thought about the man he'd been before Elena, successful but shallow, confident but lonely. He thought about how she'd changed him, made him want to be someone worthy of her love. And he thought about what Elena had said about not being able to trust her own judgment anymore. The more Jake thought about it, the more he understood Elena's reaction. She was facing a disease that would eventually steal her ability to think clearly, to make good decisions, to trust her own mind. Learning that the first person she'd trusted in years had lied to her must have felt like proof that she couldn't rely on herself anymore. But Jake also knew something Elena didn't. His love for her was absolutely real. Yes, their relationship had started with a stupid bet, but what grew between them was genuine. Jake had never felt anything like the peace and joy he'd found with Elena. He'd never wanted to protect and cherish anyone the way he wanted to protect and cherish her. The question was, how could he prove that to someone who no longer trusted her own judgment? The answer came to Jake on a Thursday afternoon while he was fixing a fence on his ranch. Elena had said she couldn't tell the difference between real love and pretend love. She couldn't trust her ability to judge his motives, but maybe she could trust his actions over time. Maybe he could show her through consistency and patience that his feelings were real. That evening, Jake drove into town and parked across the street from Elena's shop. He didn't go in. He just sat in his truck and watched her lock up for the night, making sure she got safely to her car. Then he followed at a distance until she was home safely. He did the same thing the next night and the next. After a week of this, Elena noticed. She came out of her shop and walked directly to Jake's truck. "What are you doing?" she asked through the window. "Making sure you're safe," Jake said simply. "I told you to leave me alone." "I am leaving you alone. I'm just making sure you're okay from a distance." Elena stared at him. "This is not leaving me alone, Jake." "Elena, I know you don't want to see me or talk to me. I'm respecting that. But I also know you sometimes get confused or forget things. What if something happened and you needed help? That's not your responsibility anymore. Yes, it is. Whether you forgive me or not, whether we're together or not, making sure you're safe will always be my responsibility. Because I love you. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Jake, you can't just follow me around for the rest of my life. Watch me. Elena walked back to her car without another word, but Jake noticed she drove more carefully on the way home. Over the following weeks, Jake developed a routine. He'd make sure Elena got to work safely in the morning, though he stayed far enough away that she couldn't see him. He'd check on her shop during the day without going in. He'd make sure she got home safely at night. He also started doing things for Elena that she'd never know about. When he noticed her shop's front steps were getting wobbly, he came by late at night and fixed them. When her car started making strange noises, he arranged for the mechanic to discover a problem and fix it for free, though Elena never knew Jake had paid for the repairs. One evening, Jake was sitting in his usual spot across from Elena's house when she came outside and walked over to his truck. "This has to stop," she said. "What has to stop?" "The secret help, the anonymous repairs, the mysterious car maintenance." Elena looked tired but not angry. "This is a small town, Jake. People talk. I know it's you." Jake rolled down his window. "Your steps were dangerous. Your car needed work. That's not the point. The point is that you can't take care of me from the shadows. It's not healthy for either of us." "Then let me take care of you in the open." Elena closed her eyes. "We've been through this." "No, we haven't. We went through me asking you to forgive me. We went through you not trusting my motives. But we haven't talked about what I'm actually offering." "Which is what?" Jake turned off his truck and got out, but he kept his distance. "I'm offering to love you through this disease. I'm offering to be there for all of it. The good days and the bad days and the days when you don't remember my name. I'm offering to help you live as fully as possible for as long as possible. Out of guilt. Out of love. Elena, I've had 3 weeks to think about this. 3 weeks to consider how hard it's going to be, how heartbreaking, how scary. If I was here out of guilt, don't you think I would have talked myself out of it by now?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "What about the bet, Jake? How do I get past knowing that's how this started?" "I don't know," Jake said honestly. "Maybe you can't get past it. Maybe you'll always wonder. But Elena, what if you're wrong about my motives? What if I really do love you and you're pushing away the one person who wants to go through this with you? And what if you're wrong? What if you think you love me now, but when things get really bad, you realize it was just guilt and you leave like David did?" Jake stepped closer. "Then you'll be no worse off than you are now. But if I'm right, if what I feel is real, then you'll have someone who loves you unconditionally for whatever time we have left." Elena wiped tears from her cheeks. "Jake, I'm so scared of trusting you and being wrong again." "I know, but Elena, what's the alternative? You're going to face this disease either way. The question is whether you face it alone or with someone who loves you. Someone who might love me. Someone who definitely loves you. Elena, I know you can't trust your judgment right now. I know this disease makes everything feel uncertain. So don't trust your judgment. Trust mine." Elena looked at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I have good judgment about love. I've never felt anything like this before. I've never wanted to spend my life taking care of someone, protecting someone, making them happy. If you can't trust yourself to know whether my feelings are real, trust me to know." Elena was crying openly now. "What if I forget you? What if I become someone you don't recognize? Then I'll introduce myself again every day if I have to, and I'll love whoever you become because they'll still be you. What if I need more care than you can give? Then I'll hire the best caregivers money can buy, and I'll learn how to help them help you. What if it takes years? What if you waste the best years of your life taking care of someone who doesn't even remember you?" Jake stepped closer until he was right in front of Elena. "What if loving you and taking care of you are the best years of my life? What if watching you smile on your good days and holding your hand on your bad days gives my life more meaning than anything I've ever done?" Elena looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of doubt or deception. You really mean that? I really mean that. Elena, marry me. Elena's breath caught. What? Marry me. Not because of guilt or pity or because I feel sorry for you. Marry me because I love you and I want to spend whatever time we have making sure you never doubt that again. Jake, we've known each other for 2 months. I've known I loved you for 6 weeks. How much more time do we need? Elena stared at him. This is crazy. Maybe. But Elena, we don't have the luxury of taking things slow. We don't have the luxury of dating for 2 years and then getting engaged for another year. If we're going to do this, if we're going to build a life together, we need to start now. What if I say yes and then regret it? What if the disease progresses faster than we think? Then we'll deal with it together. Elena, I'm not asking you to promise me forever. I'm asking you to promise me today and tomorrow and the day after that, for as long as you can remember making the promise. Elena was quiet for a long time, thinking. Finally, she spoke. If I marry you, I need to know you understand what you're signing up for. I need to know you've really thought about what the worst-case scenario looks like. Tell me. Eventually, I'll need full-time care. I might not recognize you. I might become angry or agitated or completely different from who I am now. I might live for years after I stop being the person you fell in love with. Jake nodded. I understand that. And you still want to marry me? Elena, I fell in love with your kindness, your strength, your grace under pressure. Those things might change as the disease progresses, but they're part of who you are at your core. Even if you forget me, even if you become someone different, I'll still see traces of the woman I fell in love with. Elena looked at Jake for a long moment. Then very quietly, she said, Yes. 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 I'll marry you. Not because I completely trust your motives and not because I'm not scared of what's coming, but because life is short and uncertain for everyone, and I'd rather spend mine with someone who claims to love me than spend it alone protecting myself from being hurt. Jake pulled Elena into his arms, holding her tight. You won't regret this. I promise you won't regret this. I might not remember it long enough to regret it, Elena said with a shaky laugh.